Picture the most important company you've probably never really thought about. Every iPhone in the world. The chips inside the servers running the artificial intelligence that everyone's talking about. The processors in your car, your laptop, the fighter jets, the graphics cards people fight over online. A staggering share of the advanced computer chips on planet Earth are made by one company, on one island, in a handful of buildings. And if that company ever stopped, if those buildings went dark, the modern global economy would seize up almost overnight. It's the reason people call Taiwan the most dangerous place on Earth. It's the reason the world's two most powerful nations are locked in a standoff over a strip of silicon. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The man who built all of this didn't want to be an engineer. He didn't want to be a businessman. He didn't found this company until he was 55 years old, an age when most people are counting down to retirement. When he was a boy, the thing he wanted most in the world, the dream he clung to through bombings and gunfire and one flight after another, was to become a writer. His name is Morris Chang, and to understand how he ended up creating the single most important manufacturing operation in human history, you have to go back to a world on fire. He was born in 1931 in Ningbo, a city on the coast of China, just south of Shanghai. His father was the director of the finance bureau for the local county government. That sounds impressive on paper, but Chang himself would later be blunt about it. Ningbo at the time was rather underdeveloped and unimportant, and most ambitious people wanted to be in the big cities: Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing. His father was one of those ambitious people. When Morris had just turned 1, his father took a deputy manager job at a bank in Nanjing, and the family followed. And that's the pattern that defines this boy's entire childhood. The family moving, chasing opportunity, and then, very soon, chasing safety. Because Morris Chang had the misfortune of being born in China in 1931. This is a child who is going to grow up inside not one war, but 3 of them, layered on top of each other. The Second Sino-Japanese War, the Second World War, and then the Chinese Civil War. When Morris was 5, his father was promoted to bank manager in Guangzhou, Canton, so the family joined him there. They'd lived in Guangzhou barely half a year when the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened, the spark that ignited the full-scale war between China and Japan, and Japanese planes began bombing the city. So his mother grabbed him and fled to nearby Hong Kong. The next year, when Guangzhou fell to the Japanese, his father fled to Hong Kong too. And for a few years, Hong Kong was the good part. The family lived there from 1937 to 1942, from the time Morris was 6 until he was 11. At that point, fewer than 1 million people lived in the city, and Morris remembered its beauty, its cleanliness. He'd remember visiting Repulse Bay with his parents, his favorite place to go. While the flames of war swept across the rest of the country, Hong Kong was a safe haven. Morris Chang would call it simply a wonderful childhood. Everyone remembers Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. What people forget is that the Japanese hit Hong Kong at almost the exact same moment, just hours later. The safe haven wasn't safe anymore. The family fled again, this time to Shanghai. And then came the journey that shows you who this kid really was. From occupied Shanghai, reaching free China meant crossing the battle lines, an escape to Chongqing, deep in the southwest, that took roughly 50 days. Chongqing wasn't just any city. During the war with Japan, after the fall of Nanjing, Chongqing became the wartime capital of nationalist China, the last redoubt, the seat of Chiang Kai-shek's government. It sat in a river valley, wrapped for much of the year in thick fog, so the Japanese couldn't bomb it effectively in winter. But when the fog lifted in the warmer months, the bombers came. Year after year, Chongqing was one of the most heavily bombed cities on the planet, a place where people carved shelters and tunnels into the hillsides and learned to time their lives around the sound of the sirens. A 50-day trek through a war as a kid. And what did Morris Chang do with that experience? He wrote a travelogue about it. He'd remember years later how his parents proudly showed that piece of writing off, and how, of all the things he lost over a lifetime of fleeing and moving, that travelogue was the one he most regretted losing. In Chongqing, he went to school at Nankai Middle School, one of the most respected schools in China, a school that had itself fled the Japanese, relocating from the north down into the wartime interior. Not a quiet suburban campus, a rigorous, disciplined school for refugees in a bombed capital in the middle of a war for national survival. And through it all, the dream held. Through his primary school years in Hong Kong and his middle school years in Chongqing and Shanghai, there were 6 or 7 years of his childhood when he was obsessed with becoming a writer as a lifelong career. He kept diaries. He wrote constantly. There's a heartbreaking little footnote to all of it. Because of all that fleeing, almost none of it survives. Everything he wrote before the age of 16 is completely gone. Only a handful of essays remain, and only because Nankai Middle School somehow preserved them for decades and published them in an alumni memoir. So here's this teenager. He has survived bombings and gunfire and crossed active battle lines, and he has come out of it, observant, watching how the world actually works. He'd talk later about seeing, even as a young person, the extremes of that society, the very rich and very powerful, and then a huge number of people who simply didn't know where their next meal was coming from. He came out of it knowing 2 things down to his bones: that war is a terrible thing, and that poverty is a terrible thing. Those weren't abstract political opinions for him. He watched them up close, as a kid, from the inside. And then his father sat him down, a banker, a practical man who had spent his whole life making careful decisions about money, looked at his talented son and gave him the advice that would, without either of them having the faintest idea, eventually reshape the entire world. He told Morris the truth as he saw it. It is very hard to make a living as a writer. Give it up. Pursue something practical, technology, engineering. If Morris Chang's father lets him chase that dream, there is, in all likelihood, no TSMC, no silicon shield, maybe a very different 21st century. Instead, the writer's dream gets folded up and put away. Chang himself, looking back, would half wonder whether it was ever real to begin with, or just a young man's fancy. Then the war with Japan ends, 1945. And for about 5 minutes, there's hope. The great enemy has been defeated. The family goes back to Shanghai. It could have been an ordinary story from here. Things settle down, the boy finishes school in peace. That's not what happens, because the moment the Japanese are gone, the other war, the one that had been simmering underneath the whole time, roars back to life. The Chinese Civil War. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek against the communists under Mao Zedong. And this time, the ground doesn't just shake from bombs. It shakes from the economy itself coming apart. This part matters because Morris Chang's father was a banker, a finance man, which means the family was standing at ground zero of one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history. In the late 1940s, nationalist China experienced hyperinflation so severe it became a textbook case for economists. The currency didn't just lose value, it evaporated. Prices doubled, then doubled again, then again in ever shorter spans. People carried bricks of banknotes to buy a bag of rice. Life savings became waste paper, and a government that can't keep its money worth anything is a government that is losing. losing the confidence of its own people, losing the war. So imagine being that banker father. You have spent your entire life mastering the careful, prudent world of money and finance, and you are watching that entire world dissolve in your hands, while an army you cannot stop closes in from the north. You are a man out of moves in the country of your birth. The ledger of this childhood, the way Chang himself would tally it decades later. Before the age of 18, he had fled 3 times and lived in 6 cities: Ningbo, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Chongqing, and Shanghai. And he had changed schools 10 times. And now he was 17, sitting in a Shanghai that was very clearly about to fall. His father's answer? Get him out. As the communist victory becomes inevitable, the family flees one final time, back to Hong Kong, that old refuge. But they don't just look for the next safe city inside China. The plan crystallizes. Morris will go to the United States, a country he has never seen, whose language he has learned only from books and classrooms, and get an education that no collapsing China can give him. In 1949, Mao Zedong stands in Beijing and declares the founding of the People's Republic of China. The nationalists lose the mainland entirely and retreat to a small island off the coast, an island called Taiwan. And in that same year, an 18-year-old Morris Chang boards a ship and leaves the Asian continent behind. He is bound for one of the most famous universities on Earth, Harvard. He doesn't know it yet, but he will never live in mainland China again. The world he was born into, the banks, the cities, the schools, the whole civilization that shaped him, is closing behind him like a door. And a young man who has spent his entire life being pushed around the map by forces far bigger than himself is about to arrive in a place where, for the first time, the choices will be his own. He arrived in 1949, an 18-year-old who had spent his whole life on the run, stepping off into Massachusetts, into a country at the absolute peak of its post-war confidence and power. It's easy to skip past how remarkable his arrival was. Morris Chang enrolled at Harvard as a freshman in the fall of 1949, and in his entire class, over 1,000 students, he was the only Chinese student, the only one. A young man who a year earlier had been fleeing a collapsing Shanghai, who had learned English mostly from books, now walking into the most storied university in America as a class of 1. And he loved it. This is one of the great turns in the whole story, because it tells you the writer never actually died. Chang would later describe that single year at Harvard as one of the most enchanting, most romantic years of his life. Harvard in that era gave every undergraduate a heavy dose of the liberal arts, literature, humanities, the great books, the life of the mind. For a boy who had dreamed of being a novelist, who had kept diaries through air raids, this was heaven. He was finally in the world he'd always wanted to live in. But that practical banker's voice, it is very hard to make a living as a writer, hadn't gone away. And now it was reinforced by cold reality. Chang was an immigrant, a refugee really, with no money behind him and no country to fall back on. The mainland was gone. There was no family fortune waiting, no safety net. He had to think hard about how a young Chinese man in 1950s America was actually going to build a life and make a living. When he did the math, the humanities didn't add up. He looked honestly at his prospects and understood something that must have hurt. As a Chinese immigrant in that era, the odds of him making it as a writer or in any liberal arts profession were slim. The doors that were open, the doors where talent and hard work could actually get a foreigner hired, where the work was concrete and the merit was measurable, those were the doors of engineering, of science, of industry. So he made the pivot, and it was a real sacrifice, not a small one. After that single enchanted year at Harvard, Morris Chang transferred to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, to study mechanical engineering. He turned away from the world of the novelist and walked deliberately into the world of the machine. He would say, decades later, that it was the right decision. But you can hear the wistfulness in how he talked about it. The practical path won, for good this time. Engineering it was. At MIT, he was good, really good. He earned his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, then stayed and earned his master's too. By his mid-20s, Morris Chang was an MIT-trained engineer with 2 degrees from one of the finest technical institutions on the planet. On paper, the immigrant kid had made it. The next logical step was obvious to everyone, including him: the doctorate, the PhD, the crown on top of it all. And this is where the story takes a turn that Morris Chang himself would call one of the luckiest things that ever happened to him. Even though it did not feel lucky at the time, it felt like failure. He took the MIT doctoral qualifying exam, the gateway to the PhD, and he failed it. Given another chance, he took it again, and he failed it again. Here is a man whose entire identity, since his father redirected him as a boy, had been built on being the student who could master anything put in front of him. He'd survived 3 wars and rebuilt his whole future on the promise of his own mind. And now, at the final hurdle, that mind hit a wall. Twice. He would remember it as the biggest setback of his young life. That failure forced a decision. No PhD meant no comfortable academic career. It meant he had to go out and get a job, in the real world, in American industry. He had to go earn a living with the degrees he had. So he started interviewing, and he got 2 offers. One from Ford, the Ford Motor Company, an American icon, the obvious, prestigious, safe choice for a young mechanical engineer. And another from a small, little-known electronics outfit called Sylvania. The 2 offers were nearly identical, except that Sylvania's monthly salary was exactly $1 higher. $1. And what Morris Chang did about that single dollar is where the entire semiconductor age quietly begins. Morris Chang wanted to go to Ford. Ford was the big name, the prestige job, the safe bet. So he called Ford up to see if they'd match it. Not even beat it, just match it. Close that $1 gap. And the Ford recruiter on the phone was cold about it. Bureaucratic. Basically told him, take it or leave it. No flexibility, no warmth. Treated him like a number. That rubbed Morris Chang exactly the wrong way. He was a proud young man who had already been through more than most people go through in a lifetime. And he was not about to be talked down to over $1 by a company that couldn't be bothered to treat him like a person. So, out of what he'd later admit was basically pride, a fit of pique, he took the other job. He went with Sylvania, the electronics company, over $1 and 1 rude phone call. That small, prideful, almost petty decision pushed Morris Chang out of the automobile industry and into electronics, into semiconductors. If that Ford recruiter had been just a little friendlier, the man who would one day build the world's most important chip company might have spent his career designing engine parts in Detroit. So it's the mid-1950s, and Morris Chang begins his career at Sylvania, working on semiconductors. And this is a wild time to be walking into this field, because the field barely exists yet. The transistor, the tiny switch that would become the fundamental building block of all modern electronics, had only been invented at Bell Labs in 1947. This is the ground floor. This is the very beginning of the electronic age. And here's this refugee kid from Ningbo who wanted to be a novelist, standing right at the start of it. learning as he goes.
But Sylvania wasn't the place where he'd make his name. His time there was rocky. The semiconductor operation was struggling, and Chang came to feel the company just wasn't managing it well. So, after a few years, he started looking again.
And in 1958, he made the move that would define the next quarter century of his life. He joined a company down in Dallas, Texas, Texas Instruments.
In 1958, Texas Instruments was becoming the most exciting place in the entire world to be a semiconductor engineer. And I mean that almost literally.
Because in that very same year, Morris Chang walked in the door, a TI engineer named Jack Kilby sat at a bench and built the first working integrated circuit, the microchip. The idea of putting multiple electronic components onto a single piece of semiconductor material. That invention would eventually win Jack Kilby the Nobel Prize. And it is, more or less, the seed of everything. Every computer, every phone, every chip in your life traces back to that breakthrough. And Morris Chang was there, inside that company, at that exact moment. The engines were lighting right as he climbed aboard. But what's fascinating about Chang's early days at TI is what it tells you about why he specifically was going to rise. He wasn't the guy inventing the circuit. He was the guy who could make it actually work. Reliably, repeatedly, by the thousands. Because inventing a chip in a lab is one thing. Manufacturing chips is a completely different, brutal, maddening problem. In those early days, you'd run a batch of these delicate devices through the process, and most of them would come out broken, useless. You might throw away the overwhelming majority of what you made. The fraction that comes out good is called the yield. And yield is the beating heart of this entire industry. If 10% of a batch comes out good, you're losing money and dying. If 90% comes out good, you're printing money on the same equipment with the same materials, with the same labor. The difference between disaster and fortune is entirely in the know-how, in how well you run the process. And Morris Chang, it turned out, had a gift for exactly this. He was handed responsibility for a struggling production line making transistors for a very specific, very important customer, IBM. And IBM had its own version of the same product, made in its own facilities, and IBM's line was getting better yields than Texas Instruments was. Your customer is beating you at making the very thing you're selling them. So Morris Chang set out to close that gap. And then he did something more ambitious. He didn't just want to match IBM. He wanted to beat them. And the way he did it is the whole point. He didn't guess. He didn't tweak things randomly and hope. He treated the manufacturing process as a set of variables to be understood and controlled. Adjust one parameter, watch what happens to the yield, learn from it, adjust the next. Temperature, timing, chemistry, handling, all the countless little steps where a device could be born good or born ruined. He hunted the failures down. And methodically, patiently, he drove the yields on that line up past IBM's. The student had beaten the teacher. That success got noticed because in the semiconductor business, the person who can reliably squeeze good chips out of a stubborn process is worth their weight in gold. Texas Instruments kept handing him harder problems, bigger operations, more responsibility. Morris Chang had found the thing he was extraordinary at. Not the invention, but the manufacturing, the making, the relentless, unglamorous, deeply difficult art of producing these things at scale, cheaply, and well. Then TI did something that tells you exactly how much they valued him. Remember, this is a man who does not have a PhD. He failed the qualifying exam at MIT twice, and that failure had haunted him. It had closed a door he badly wanted open. Texas Instruments, seeing what they had in him, decided to open that door back up. They sent him to Stanford University to earn his doctorate, and they paid for it. The company funded him to go get a PhD in electrical engineering. The credential MIT denied him. TI handed him the keys to go get. And Morris Chang did not waste it. He went to Stanford, cleared the hurdle this time, and earned his PhD in electrical engineering in 1964. The setback he'd called the biggest of his young life was erased, and erased by the very company that had bet on his talent. He came back to Texas Instruments as Dr. Morris Chang, and he came back to keep climbing. Through the 1960s, Chang rose to run TI's entire semiconductor business, the crown jewel of the company, the part riding the integrated circuit revolution. He was managing thousands of people, making decisions about products, factories, pricing, about which technologies to bet the business on. He had gone from a refugee with 2 degrees and no PhD and no country to one of the most powerful executives in American semiconductors. By the standards of the day, this was an astonishing ascent. But it's what he learned along the way, one specific, counterintuitive insight about how to price a semiconductor, that would turn out to be the real treasure. Because buried inside all those years of driving yields up and watching costs come down, Morris Chang noticed a pattern about how the economics of chips actually worked over time. The pattern is what people in the industry call the learning curve, and it's the single most important economic fact about making chips. Every time you double the total number of units you've ever produced, your cost per unit drops by a consistent percentage. The more you make, the more you learn. The more you learn, the better your yields get, and the cheaper each chip becomes. Experience itself drives the cost down. Volume is the teacher, and lower cost is the reward. Most executives at most companies looked at that curve and priced their products the normal, sensible, conservative way. You look at what it costs you to make the chip today. You add your margin on top, and that's your price. As your costs come down over time, maybe you lower the price a bit. Follow the costs down. Safe. Rational. That's how a prudent businessman prices a product. Morris Chang looked at that same curve and saw something radical. Why price based on what it costs me today when I already know with near certainty what it's going to cost me a year or 2 from now? If I'm going to sell a lot of these, my costs are going to fall off a cliff as the volume piles up. So why not price the chip today at what it'll cost me tomorrow? That's the heresy. Price ahead of the curve. Set your price low, sometimes below your current cost, low enough that you might actually lose money on the early units, because you're betting on the future cost, not the present one. And the logic is beautiful and ruthless at the same time. When you price that aggressively low, you win a flood of orders. You take the market, and huge volume rockets you down the learning curve faster than anyone else. Your costs collapse exactly as you predicted, and now you're actually making money at that low price, while your competitors, who priced the safe way and never got the volume, are stuck higher up the curve, unable to match you. You've used price as a weapon to buy the very volume that makes the low price profitable. You bet on the future, and by betting on it, you make it come true. This made people nervous. Deliberately pricing below your cost takes nerve, and it takes conviction that you understand the manufacturing better than the other guy. But Morris Chang did understand the manufacturing better than the other guy. He was the one who'd spent a decade driving costs down that curve with his own hands. So under Chang, Texas Instruments used this strategy to go on the attack. They priced aggressively, they took market share, they drove volume, and they used that volume to dominate the transistor and integrated circuit markets of the 1960s. It was brutal on the competition, and it worked. And notice what Morris Chang has now assembled inside his head without fully knowing what it's for yet. Manufacturing is everything. Yield is the game. Scale and volume drive costs down a predictable curve, and whoever can make chips the best and the most and the cheapest controls the whole field, because everyone else has to come to them. That last piece is not just a pricing tactic. That is the entire business model of TSMC 20 years before TSMC exists, already forming, in embryo, inside this man's understanding of how the world of chips really works. But he's not going to found that company yet. Not even close. Morris Chang is a rising star at Texas Instruments, climbing toward the very top of the American corporate establishment. And for a while, the climb only steepens. By the end of the 1960s, Morris Chang is not just a successful engineer anymore. He is a genuine star in American industry, and the sheer improbability of that deserves a moment. A refugee from a country that no longer existed as he'd known it. No family fortune, no PhD, until TI paid for one. A Chinese immigrant in Dallas, in an era when there were almost no Asian faces in the boardrooms of corporate America. And here he is, running the semiconductor operations of the company that invented the integrated circuit. He didn't climb that ladder by fitting in or knowing the right people. He climbed it because the chips worked, and the yields went up, and the business made money. In a field where the results are brutally measurable, Morris Chang delivered results nobody could argue with. And Texas Instruments kept promoting him. In 1972, he was made a group vice president, and eventually he became one of the most senior executives in the entire corporation, overseeing operations that stretched around the globe, commanding thousands upon thousands of employees. He had, in the fullest sense of the phrase, made it. But around this time, quietly, the story starts to turn. As he rose higher and higher inside Texas Instruments, they moved him away from the thing he loved. They moved him away from semiconductors. TI, in the 1970s, was making a big strategic push into consumer products. Calculators, digital watches, home computers. It was the hot new direction. And they took their star executive, Morris Chang, and put him in charge of a big piece of that consumer business. On the surface, it's a promotion, a vote of confidence, handing a proven leader the company's exciting new frontier. It was a mistake. And it was a mistake in two ways that matter. First, the consumer electronics push largely didn't work. TI poured itself into calculators and watches and home computers, and it ran headlong into brutal competition and thin margins and a market that chewed companies up. Second, and this is the deeper thing, he'd been pulled off his home turf. His genius, his whole life's accumulated understanding, was in the making of chips. By moving him up and over into consumer products, TI had taken the finest semiconductor mind in the building and sat him down at a different piano. He was still enormously capable, but he wasn't where his magic was. For roughly 2 decades, the story of Morris Chang and Texas Instruments had been a climb, up and up, redemption after redemption. Now the trajectory starts to flatten, and the relationship starts to strain. Because a man like Morris Chang, proud, brilliant, certain of what he knows, is not content to be moved away from the work he was born to do and set to managing a business that's losing. He was still one of the most senior people at the company. Still, on paper, a candidate for the biggest job of all, the top of Texas Instruments itself. But the company was placing its bets elsewhere, and it was placing Morris Chang elsewhere too. Every immigrant success story has a ceiling in it somewhere. A moment where the person discovers that no matter how far they've climbed, there's a rung reserved for someone else. For Morris Chang, that moment came at the very top of Texas Instruments. For years, he had been talked about as a genuine contender for the ultimate prize, the presidency, the chief executive's chair. He was, by his track record, one of the most qualified people in the building. And when the decision was finally made about who would lead Texas Instruments into the future, the answer was not him. He was passed over.
The top job went to someone else.
We should be careful and honest here, because people's motives are hard to know for certain. But this is 1970s corporate America. Morris Chang was a Chinese immigrant in an executive world that was almost entirely white, at a time when the highest seats of American industry simply were not going to a man like him. Whatever the stated reasons, the outcome was that the man arguably most fit to run the place was not the man chosen to run it. And there was that quieter wound underneath. They'd already moved him off of semiconductors, his home, his genius, and saddled him with a struggling business. Now he was told, in effect, that the top of the mountain belonged to someone else. A hard place to be for a man of his pride and his gifts, a man who had rebuilt his entire life on the certainty of his own competence. So Morris Chang did what a proud, brilliant man does when the ladder runs out. In 1983, after 25 years, a quarter of a century at the company that had sent him to Stanford, that had made him a star, that had been in every real sense his American home, he left Texas Instruments. By any conventional reading, this looks like the sad, deflating final chapter. The great career stalled and ended, the immigrant who climbed so high and stopped just short, out the door in his early 50s. Except that everything Morris Chang is famous for hasn't happened yet. TSMC does not exist. The Silicon Shield does not exist. All of it is still in front of him, and he is 52 years old. Most people at 52, passed over for the top job, are managing their decline. A soft landing, a board seat, a quiet retirement. Morris Chang's greatest work had not even begun. The bitter ending at Texas Instruments was not the close of his story. It was the thing that freed him to go write it. He didn't go straight to Taiwan, and he didn't go straight to founding anything. In 1984, Morris Chang took a new job, President and Chief Operating Officer of General Instrument, a big, established electronics company based in New York. On paper, it's a step back onto solid ground. A senior title, a respectable landing after the disappointment at TI. It lasted barely a year. The General Instrument chapter is one of the least happy stretches of Morris Chang's professional life, and it's the part that gets skipped over most often. But something important happens inside it. The job itself wasn't a good fit. The company's direction and culture didn't sit right with him, and within about a year, he was gone from there too. Step back and look at where he stands now, because it's genuinely stark. It's the mid-1980s. He's in his mid-50s. In a span of a couple of years, he has left Texas Instruments after a quarter of a century, and General Instrument after barely 12 months. He is one of the most experienced semiconductor executives on planet Earth. And he is, essentially, a man without a company. But during these same years, Morris Chang was watching the semiconductor industry change shape in front of him, and he was noticing a gap, a hole in how the whole business was organized. Filling that hole is the entire idea that becomes TSMC. In those days, the semiconductor world was dominated by what were called integrated device manufacturers, companies like Texas Instruments, like Intel, like Motorola. And integrated meant they did everything themselves, all under one roof. They designed the chips, they manufactured them, they packaged them, tested them, sold them, soup to nuts. And doing the whole thing meant one enormous, terrifying requirement. You had to build a fab, a semiconductor fabrication plant, the factory where chips are actually made. One of the most expensive and complex things human beings know how to build. Even back then, a state-of-the-art fab could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And the number was climbing relentlessly, year after year. So the price of admission to the chip business was astronomical. If you were a brilliant young engineer with a genius idea for a new chip design, It didn't matter how good your idea was. Unless you could raise the fortune required to build your own factory, you were locked out. The barrier to entry was a wall of money.
And Morris Chang, with his whole life's understanding of manufacturing, looked at that wall and saw the opportunity hiding behind it. Because he knew something most people didn't fully appreciate. Designing a chip and manufacturing a chip are two completely different skills, two different worlds.
There were, increasingly, brilliant people who were fantastic at designing chips but had no business and no money running a factory. What if you could split those two things apart? What if there were a company that did nothing but manufacture, a pure factory for hire, so that all those brilliant designers could just design and send their designs to be built by someone else?
This idea was, in fact, floating around the industry in pieces. The very first small fabless design companies that designed chips without owning any factory, were just beginning to appear, and they were desperate for someone to actually build their chips. But nobody had built a company purely and only to be that manufacturer for everyone. It was a notion in the air, unformed, unproven, without a champion.
And Morris Chang, passed over, companyless, in his mid-50s, carrying 3 decades of hard-won knowledge about the one thing that idea depended on, which is how to manufacture chips better than anyone else on Earth, was exactly the man who could see the whole shape of it. He just needed the one thing he didn't have, a place to build it, and someone willing to bet a fortune on a 54-year-old man's radical idea. And the call that would give him both was about to come from the last place he probably expected. From a small island off the coast of China, the one the nationalists had fled to back in 1949. From Taiwan. The invitation came from a man named K.T. Lee, and if you don't know that name, you should, because K.T. Lee is one of the central architects of what became known as the Taiwan economic miracle. He was a physicist by training, who became one of the most influential officials in the Taiwanese government. People would later call him the father of Taiwan's technology industry. And in the mid-1980s, K.T. Lee had his eye on Morris Chang. To understand why, you have to understand where Taiwan was at that moment. This is the island the defeated nationalists retreated to in 1949 when they lost the mainland to Mao. For decades after, Taiwan had built its economy on lower-cost manufacturing, textiles, cheap goods, assembly work. By the 1980s, the leadership could see the writing on the wall. That model had a ceiling. Other countries could always do cheap labor cheaper. If Taiwan was going to have a secure, prosperous future, it had to climb into something more valuable, more sophisticated, harder to replicate. It had to get into semiconductors. But wanting a semiconductor industry and knowing how to build one are two very different things. Taiwan had made some early moves, a research institute, some licensed technology, trained engineers. To make a real leap, they needed something they couldn't manufacture domestically, a world-class leader, someone who would actually run semiconductor operations at the highest level, at global scale. There were, in all the world, only a handful of people like that. And one of them was a Chinese-born, American-trained executive who had just walked away from 25 years at Texas Instruments and was, at that very moment, unattached. So K.T. Lee reached out to Morris Chang and asked him to come to Taiwan, to come lead the island's flagship technology research organization, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI. It was, in effect, an invitation to take charge of an entire nation's push into advanced technology. Consider what's actually being asked here. He's 54 years old, a wealthy, established American executive. America has been his home since he stepped off that ship at 18. And he is being asked to leave all of it behind and move to an island he had never actually lived on, to take a government-adjacent job for a fraction of what he could earn in American industry, in the service of another country's grand ambition. By any normal calculation,
That's a strange thing to say yes to. But Morris Chang was not in a normal situation, and he was not a normal man. His path in America had run into a ceiling, passed over at TI, and the General Instrument chapter hadn't worked. The obvious next mountain wasn't there. And here, suddenly, was something else entirely. Not just a job, a mission. A whole nation prepared to bet on him, handing him the resources and the mandate to build something from close to nothing. For a man of his ambition and his talent, that was not a step down. That was an open field. The one thing his American career could no longer offer him. There was something deeper, too. Taiwan was, in a sense, the last piece of the China he had come from. The China that had shaped him, and that had been closed behind him when Mao's forces took the mainland. This was a chance to build something extraordinary among his own people, in a Chinese society, to give his gifts to a place that would remember him for it. For a man who had spent his childhood being pushed across the map by history, there was a certain gravity to being invited back. So Morris Chang said yes. In 1985, he packed up his American life and moved to Taiwan to become the president of ITRI. He didn't fully know yet what he was going to build. The pure-play foundry was still an idea in his head, not a company in the world. But he had the knowledge, and now, for the first time, he had the backing of an entire government determined to make a leap into the future. The refugee who'd fled that region as a boy was coming back as the man they were betting the nation's future on. And almost immediately, they were going to ask him to do something that sounded, frankly, close to impossible. The organization Morris Chang took over, ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, is one of the great underappreciated engines in this whole story. It was a government-backed research organization whose job was essentially to be Taiwan's on-ramp to advanced technology, the place where the island went to acquire, absorb, and develop the technical know-how it didn't yet have. And in the years before Chang arrived, ITRI had already pulled off something remarkable. Back in the 1970s, Taiwan had struck a technology transfer deal with the American company RCA, licensing semiconductor manufacturing know-how and sending a group of young Taiwanese engineers to the United States to learn how it was done. Those engineers came back and became the seed corn of the entire industry, the first generation in Taiwan who actually knew how to make chips. So when Morris Chang took the helm, he wasn't inheriting an empty building. He was inheriting a nucleus. But it was still small, still early, still a long way from the world-class semiconductor industry Taiwan's leaders were dreaming about. And here's the mandate that landed on Chang's desk. The government didn't just want a nice research institute. They wanted an industry, a real, self-sustaining, globally competitive semiconductor industry that could stand on the world stage against the giants of America and Japan. They were asking Morris Chang to figure out how a small island with limited resources could break into a game dominated by companies with decades of head start and oceans of money. This is where Morris Chang's whole life comes together. He sat down and thought hard about that problem. How does Taiwan actually win here? And he approached it with the clear eyes of a man who had spent 30 years inside the American semiconductor industry and knew exactly where its strengths and weaknesses were. His analysis was ruthless and honest. In chip design, the creative front-end work of dreaming up new chips, the Americans were far ahead, with their universities, their design talent, their entrepreneurial culture. Taiwan couldn't out-design Silicon Valley, not then. In the deep research and invention of new technology, again, the West was ahead. So where could Taiwan actually compete? The answer Chang landed on was manufacturing, operations, the disciplined, relentless, high-quality execution of making things, running the factory, driving the yields, hitting the schedules, controlling the costs. Taiwan had a workforce that was skilled, hardworking, and well-suited to exactly that kind of precise, process-driven work. It wasn't the glamorous part of the industry, But it was the part where Taiwan could be the best in the world. Two streams of this entire story are flowing together into one river here. On one side, Morris Chang's personal genius, the thing he'd been extraordinary at since the day he beat IBM's yields, was manufacturing. On the other side, Taiwan's national strength was also manufacturing. The man's greatest talent and the nation's greatest strength were the exact same thing. And sitting in Morris Chang's head, waiting all these years, was the idea that could turn that shared strength into a company unlike any the world had ever seen. A company that did nothing but manufacture for everyone. The pure play foundry. Everything he was and everything Taiwan was pointed straight at it. So he decided to build it. And what he was about to propose was so unusual, so untested, that when he took it out into the world looking for partners and money, almost everyone he approached would tell him the same thing. It will never work. The idea, laid out in its purest form, is genuinely one of the most consequential business ideas of the 20th century. And its beauty is in how simple it sounds once you get it. Every chip company in the world, up to this point, did two fundamentally different things. It designed chips, and it manufactured chips. Morris Chang's idea was to take those two halves and rip them apart, and then build a company that did only the second half. A company that would never, ever design its own chips. A company that would never sell a product under its own name. A company that would do nothing but manufacture other people's designs. A pure play foundry. A factory for hire and only a factory for hire. And the genius of it comes down to a single word: trust. The customers would be chip design companies. In the old world, if you were a small design company that wanted your chips made, you went asking for spare factory capacity at one of the big integrated manufacturers, a Texas Instruments, an Intel. But those companies designed their own chips too. They were, or could become, your direct competitors. So the moment you handed them your brilliant new design, you were handing your secrets to a rival. And they would always prioritize their own products over yours. You were a second-class customer in their factory, filling in the gaps. Now flip it. What if there were a manufacturer that made a sacred promise never to design its own chips? A company with no products of its own, that could never compete with you, that existed for the sole purpose of building your designs and making you successful. Suddenly, you could trust it completely. You could hand over your most precious secrets without fear. That neutrality, that promise never to compete with its own customers, was the foundation of the entire thing. Morris Chang understood that a foundry's greatest asset wasn't just its factory, it was its trustworthiness. That one idea unlocks everything. If a company like this exists, then you no longer need a fortune to enter the chip business. You don't need to build a fab. You can be 3 brilliant engineers in a room with a great design. You send the file to the foundry, and the foundry makes it for you. The wall of money that had locked everyone out of the industry comes crashing down. Morris Chang's foundry wouldn't just be a company. It would be the thing that let 1,000 other companies be born. It would democratize the entire industry. That's the vision. And in hindsight, it's obviously brilliant. So why did almost everyone tell him it would never work? Because in 1985, it sounded backwards, foolish even. The whole prestige and power of the semiconductor industry lived in design. The clever, creative, high-margin work of inventing chips. Manufacturing was seen as the grunt work, the low-status, low-margin end of the business. And Morris Chang was proposing to build a company that did only the grunt work and none of the glamorous part. To a lot of smart people, that looked like deliberately choosing to be a servant in an industry of kings. There was a harder, more practical objection, and it was a fair one. A pure foundry only survives if enough customers show up to keep those insanely expensive factories running full.
And in 1985, the fabless design industry, all those customers who would supposedly show up, barely existed. Chang was proposing to build hugely expensive factories to serve a market that had not really been born. Build the foundry, and maybe the customers come. Or maybe they don't, and you've built the most expensive empty building in history. So Morris Chang took his idea out into the world to find a partner, because Taiwan couldn't fund and staff this alone. It needed a big, established semiconductor company to invest, to provide technology, to lend credibility. He went to the giants, the great American and Japanese chip companies, the very peers he'd worked alongside for decades. And one after another, they said no. They didn't believe a pure-play foundry could ever be a good business. Some of them essentially told him the idea was a loser.
One of the most respected semiconductor executives alive, going hat in hand to his own industry, offering them a piece of what would become the most valuable manufacturing company in the history of the world. And they turned him down. Nearly all of them. Because there was one company from a country with its own long, proud history in electronics that was willing to listen. A European giant called Philips. And their yes, grudging, hard negotiated, and absolutely essential, is the reason TSMC got to exist at all. The deal that got hammered out is worth understanding, because it tells you exactly how much of a shoestring against the odds venture this really was at the start. This was not some confident, well-funded launch. This was a scramble to cobble together enough money and credibility to get the thing off the ground at all. Here's roughly how the money came together. The Taiwanese government, through a development fund, put up the largest single share. This was, after all, a national project, the nation's big bet on its own future. Then, Philips came in as the key foreign partner, taking a significant stake and bringing two things Taiwan desperately needed: manufacturing technology to license and the credibility of a major global name attached to the venture. And the rest of the money had to be raised from wealthy private Taiwanese businessmen, many of whom, by various accounts, invested reluctantly. They weren't putting their money in because they believed in the radical foundry vision. Some invested because when your nation's leadership asks you to back the national project, you find a way to say yes. The enthusiasm was, let's say, thin. So in 1987, with that patchwork of funding, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, was founded, and Morris Chang, at 56 years old, became its chairman. Our whole culture tells a founder story that this violates completely. The myth of the 22-year-old genius in a garage or a dorm room. Morris Chang founded the most important manufacturing company in the world in his mid-50s, on the far side of a career that had already peaked and hit its ceiling. Everything before this, the wars, the writing dream, the quarter century at TI, all of it was, in a sense, just the training. The main event started when most people are thinking about slowing down. And the beginning was humble. This is not the gleaming, world-dominating TSMC of today. The company started out with modest, older-generation manufacturing technology. Chang himself would freely admit that in its early years, TSMC's process technology lagged well behind industry leaders like Intel by several years. They were a small foundry in Taiwan, using licensed and somewhat dated technology, trying to convince the world to send them work. And that first factory carried a weight that's hard to overstate. A fab is monstrously expensive, and a foundry's entire business model depends on keeping that fab running full, packed with orders around the clock. An idle fab is a financial catastrophe. Hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment sitting there, depreciating, producing nothing, bleeding money every single day. So from day one, TSMC faced the terrifying version of that chicken and egg problem. Strip away all the later glory, and here is Morris Chang's actual situation. A brand new company built on an idea most of the industry thinks won't work. Backers who mostly don't believe in it. Technology a few years behind the leaders. A hugely expensive factory that will hemorrhage money if he can't fill it. And a customer base that hasn't really been born yet. That is the starting line. That is what the future titan of the semiconductor world looked like in 1987. And there was no magic, no secret weapon that solved it. There was just Morris Chang and a very small team going out into the world, one customer at a time, trying to convince people to take a chance on an unproven foundry on a small island most of them had barely thought about. This is one of the most human stretches of the whole story. Here's Morris Chang, and he is out there personally reaching out to companies, working his decades of contacts, making the case, asking people to take a chance on him. The Titan was, for a while, a salesman. And a lot of the answers were no, or worse, indifference. Put yourself in the shoes of a chip company being approached in the late 1980s. TSMC is new. Its technology is a few years behind the leaders. The whole pure-play foundry concept is unproven. Nobody's ever built a big, successful business doing only this. Why would you bet your product, your schedule, your reputation on this unknown quantity? The safe thing was to stick with what you knew. So Chang and his team had to fight for every early customer. And the orders came in slowly, and the fab was not always as full as it needed to be. The whole thing lived for a while in that dangerous zone where a young, capital-intensive company can quietly bleed to death. The first real lifeline came from the partner who'd believed enough to buy in. Philips brought more than money and a famous name. It licensed manufacturing processes that helped TSMC get running. And it became a customer, a source of actual orders, actual volume, feeding that hungry, expensive fab in those precarious first years, while the rest of the market slowly woke up. But Philips didn't carry them. The real work was the grinding accumulation of customers, and when a small design company did take the chance and send TSMC a job, they discovered something. TSMC did exactly what it promised. It manufactured their chips, it did not compete with them, it did not steal their designs, and it treated them not as a second-class nuisance filling spare capacity, but as the entire point of the company's existence. For a small, fabless company, that was a revelation. At TSMC, they were the customer. The whole place existed to serve them. And that experience was worth more than being a few years ahead on technology, because a design company could work around slightly older process technology. What it could not work around was the fear of handing its crown jewels to a competitor. TSMC removed that fear entirely, and word began to spread through the small but growing community of chip designers. So, the survival of TSMC in these early years wasn't one dramatic moment. It was Morris Chang's manufacturing discipline, making sure the chips came out good. Plus, the Philips partnership, keeping credibility and some of the volume flowing. Plus, the slow, one-at-a-time accumulation of customers who tried the foundry and found it did exactly what it said it would. Brick by brick, order by order. The company didn't explode into greatness. It clawed its way into existence. But to go from surviving to truly winning, to become not just a viable little foundry, but a company the whole industry took seriously, TSMC needed something more. It needed a stamp of approval from a name so powerful that its blessing would tell the entire world this small Taiwanese foundry was for real. And that blessing, improbably, was going to come from the most famous chipmaker on the planet. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Intel was becoming the most powerful and prestigious semiconductor company in the world. The company whose microprocessors ran the personal computer revolution. The Intel Inside era was dawning, its chips at the heart of nearly every PC on Earth. When it came to manufacturing chips at the highest level, Intel was the gold standard, the company everyone measured themselves against. Andy Grove's Intel was the mountaintop. And there was a personal thread here, because the world of top semiconductor executives was small. Morris Chang and the leaders of Intel moved in the same circles, peers in the same tiny fraternity at the top of the industry. So when Chang went looking for the credibility that could transform TSMC's fortunes, he understood exactly how valuable it would be to get Intel to vouch for his little foundry.
Here's how the blessing worked. Intel, being Intel, was famously demanding about manufacturing quality. Obsessive, rigorous, exacting. If TSMC wanted Intel's business, and more importantly, Intel's approval, it would have to prove its factories met Intel's standards. So Intel came in and audited TSMC. Put the young Taiwanese foundry through an intense certification process, inspecting the operation, hunting for problems, measuring it against the toughest yardstick in the entire industry. And they found problems. Intel's engineers identified a whole list of issues at TSMC that needed to be fixed, deficiencies in the process, things that fell short of Intel's exacting standards. That could have been humiliating. Instead, it was the best thing that could have happened. TSMC took Intel's list and went to work, correcting the problems one by one, bringing the operation up to Intel's standard. In doing so, TSMC didn't just win a customer, it forced its own manufacturing to level up dramatically, to meet the highest bar in the world. The audit made them better. It was like being trained by the reigning champion. And once TSMC passed, once Intel certified the foundry and began sending it some business, everything changed. Because now TSMC could go to the rest of the industry and say, in effect, Intel trusts us. The most demanding chipmaker on the planet has inspected our factories and put its work in our hands. If we're good enough for Intel, we're good enough for you. That stamp of approval was worth more than any amount of advertising. It told the whole nervous, skeptical market that this small Taiwanese foundry was the real thing. And then the flywheel begins to turn. This is the moment the whole idea stops being a gamble and starts becoming a revolution. TSMC's credibility rises, and as its credibility rises, more chip designers feel safe sending it their work. And here's the crucial part. TSMC's very existence made it possible for entirely new companies to be born. Companies with no factory at all, no fab, no wall of money, just brilliant designs, and a foundry they could trust to build them. An ambitious engineer with a great idea for a chip didn't need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars anymore. They just needed a design and TSMC's phone number. More fabless companies means more customers for TSMC. More customers means more volume. And more volume, Morris Chang's whole life coming back around, means TSMC rockets down that learning curve, driving yields up and costs down, getting better and better at manufacturing. The better TSMC gets, the more customers it draws, which drives even more volume. Round and round. The thing starts to feed itself. The idea nobody wanted was working. The heresy was becoming the future. And Morris Chang, the man who'd been passed over, the 56-year-old who'd started over, was sitting at the center of a machine that was about to reshape the entire technology industry and quietly make his small island one of the most strategically important places on the face of the earth. The thing TSMC actually sold deserves a closer look, because it wasn't just chips. Anyone can run a factory. What Morris Chang built, and what turned out to be the deepest and most durable part of the whole enterprise, was trust. And that's almost a technical achievement, not a warm and fuzzy one. The core promise, never compete with your own customers, was treated as close to sacred and defended fiercely, because Chang understood that the instant a customer suspected TSMC of drifting into designing its own competing chips, the trust would shatter and the business would collapse. In an industry built on secrets, TSMC made itself the one place you could hand over your secrets without fear. Because a fabless company betting on TSMC is betting its entire existence. If the chips come out with poor yields, it loses money it may not have. If the chips are late, it misses its market window, and a competitor eats its lunch. If the quality is inconsistent, its own reputation is destroyed. It has no factory of its own to fall back on. TSMC is its factory. The level of trust required is total. And that kind of trust is earned through one thing and one thing only: relentless, boring, obsessive reliability. Good yields again and again. Hitting the schedule again and again. Consistent quality, batch after batch, year after year. There's no single dramatic breakthrough that wins it. It's won through thousands of orders delivered exactly as promised, until the customers simply stop worrying. And who on earth was better equipped to build a company around exactly that than the man whose singular gift, going all the way back to beating IBM's yields in the 1950s, was the deep, patient mastery of manufacturing. The whole company was, in a sense, his personal genius scaled up into an institution. Chang understood something subtle, too. In the foundry model, TSMC's success and its customers' success were perfectly aligned. TSMC only made money when its customers thrived and placed more orders, so it had every incentive to make its customers win. Chang would describe the customers, in essence, as partners, and he built the company's reputation on being the partner you could always count on. There's an idea he championed that captures the whole philosophy. TSMC would function almost as a shared, trusted foundry for the entire industry. Not a competitor to the chip companies, but a piece of infrastructure they could all rely on. Something like a great public utility of manufacturing, except privately built and run with ferocious excellence. And as the company kept its promises, order after order, year after year, the trust compounded into a moat. An advantage that had almost nothing to do with any single piece of technology, and everything to do with reputation and a track record no newcomer could replicate overnight. You cannot fake decades of reliability. You cannot shortcut the trust of an industry. Meanwhile, TSMC's existence was rewiring the entire structure of the technology industry. By offering manufacturing as a service, reliable, neutral, trustworthy, TSMC had split the atom of the semiconductor industry. Design and manufacturing could now live in separate companies, and that changed who was allowed to dream. You didn't need to be a billion-dollar giant to start a chip company anymore. You needed talent, a great idea, and enough money to design, a tiny fraction of what a factory costs. A handful of brilliant engineers could start a company, design something extraordinary, and get it built by the best manufacturer in the world, without ever pouring a single foundation for a single fab. And so they did. A whole ecosystem of fabless companies bloomed in the space TSMC opened up, and some of them became household names. The company that designs the graphics chips at the heart of the AI boom, Fabless, built on TSMC. The companies designing the processors in your smartphones, the chips in your networking gear, the specialized silicon in countless devices. Over and over, fabless companies standing on the foundation TSMC provided. Even Apple, designing the custom chips that power the iPhone and the Mac, those designs go to TSMC to be manufactured. An enormous share of the most advanced silicon in your life was designed by a company that owns no factory and built by one company that designs nothing. And the causation matters because it's easy to get it backwards. It's not that a bunch of fabless companies happened to appear and TSMC served them. TSMC's existence caused them to appear. You cannot have a fabless company without a foundry to build your chips. Morris Chang didn't just enter an industry, he created the ground on which a whole new industry could grow. And there's a symmetry in it, going right back to the boy and his practical banker father. Chang had built something that democratized creation. All those brilliant designers who would have been locked out,
The small teams, the startups, the dreamers with a better idea? TSMC gave them a way in. The man who'd given up his own dream of being a creator built the machine that let thousands of other creators bring their ideas into the world. But there's a flip side to that triumph, and it's what turns this from a business story into a geopolitical one. As more of the world's chip design became fabless, more of the world's actual chip manufacturing concentrated into fewer and fewer places, and increasingly, at the cutting edge, into one place, into TSMC, into Taiwan. The whole planet's most advanced electronics were coming to depend on the factories of a single company on a single island in one of the most geopolitically tense spots on Earth. The world had quietly placed an enormous bet, without ever really deciding to, on the reliability of TSMC's Taiwanese fabs. And in September of 1999, at about 1:47 in the morning, that bet got called. It's known as the 9/21 earthquake, named for the date, September 21st, 1999. In the small hours of the morning, a massive quake, magnitude 7.6 or so, tore through central Taiwan. It was one of the deadliest and most destructive disasters in the island's modern history. Thousands of people were killed. Tens of thousands of buildings collapsed or were damaged. It was a genuine national catastrophe. And first and foremost, it was a human tragedy on a terrible scale. But there was a second story riding on top of the human one, and the whole world's technology industry felt it immediately. A semiconductor fab is one of the most delicate manufacturing environments ever created by human beings. Inside, you're working at scales far smaller than a speck of dust. The air is filtered to a cleanliness thousands of times greater than an operating room. The machines have to be aligned to almost unimaginable precision. Everything depends on absolute stability. Stable power, stable temperature, stable ground. And an earthquake shakes all of it at once. The power cutting out mid-process across the whole facility, the ground itself moving. An earthquake is, in a sense, the natural enemy of a semiconductor fab. The quake knocked out power across much of Taiwan, including the industrial parks where TSMC's fabs sat. Production stopped. Wafers that were mid-process, hugely valuable, representing weeks of work, were ruined. And in that moment, the entire technology world suddenly, viscerally, understood something it had been quietly ignoring. An enormous chunk of the planet's chip manufacturing had concentrated onto one seismically active island. When Taiwan's power went down, chip supply chains around the globe felt the tremor. Companies thousands of miles away, who'd never thought much about where their chips came from, suddenly realized how exposed they were. And here's where TSMC's response became legendary, and where all that trust got put to the ultimate test. Because how a company behaves in a disaster tells you everything about it. TSMC moved with extraordinary speed and discipline. They got their people mobilized. They worked to restore power and get the fabs back online with a focus and urgency that impressed the entire industry. They assessed the damage, they communicated with their customers, and they recovered far faster than many had feared. Within a relatively short time, the fabs were running again, and the damage, while real and costly, was far from the catastrophe it could have been. For a fabless customer whose entire existence depended on those factories, this was the fear that had always lived in the back of the mind, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake hitting that island. And TSMC absorbed the blow, recovered fast, and kept its commitments. In a strange way, the disaster proved TSMC's resilience. It showed the world this company could take the worst nature could throw at it and keep delivering. The trust didn't shatter. It got stronger. But the deeper, longer-lasting consequence of that earthquake was conceptual. It forced everyone, governments, companies, strategists, to reckon with just how dependent the world had become on Taiwan for its most advanced chips. And that dependence, over the following years,
hardened into one of the most important ideas in modern geopolitics. People started calling it the Silicon Shield. Taiwan lives under the constant shadow of a much larger neighbor across the strait, the People's Republic of China, which regards the island as its own territory and has never renounced the possibility of taking it by force. Taiwan's security is, to put it mildly, one of the most dangerous questions on the planet. And the argument of the Silicon Shield is this: Taiwan's absolute centrality to global chip manufacturing makes it too economically vital for the world to allow it to be destroyed or seized. The whole global economy, including China's own, depends on those fabs continuing to run. That dependence, the theory goes, acts as a kind of deterrent. The chips protect the island. Now, people argue fiercely about whether the Silicon Shield is real, whether it actually protects Taiwan or just makes it a bigger target. That's a genuine debate. But what nobody disputes is that Taiwan's chip industry, TSMC above all, has become a factor in the strategic calculations of the most powerful nations on Earth. The factories Morris Chang built are now discussed in wargaming rooms and national security meetings. That is how far this story travels. But Morris Chang's own story wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Even after building all of this, even in his 70s, even after handing over the reins, he was going to be pulled back into the fight. The industry was entering its most brutal, most expensive, most technologically punishing era yet. And TSMC was going to need its founder one more time. By the 2000s, Morris Chang was no longer the scrappy underdog begging for customers. He was one of the most revered business figures in Asia, chairman of a global powerhouse, the man they'd started calling the godfather of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. And like any founder who's built something great, he faced the question every founder eventually faces. When do you let go? So he tried. In 2005, at 74 years old, Morris Chang stepped back from the CEO role and handed day-to-day leadership of TSMC to a successor, staying on as chairman. The natural order of things. The founder ages, the founder steps aside, a new generation takes over. It looked like the graceful final act of an extraordinary career. It didn't hold. A couple of years later, the world was hit by the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, a brutal economic storm that hammered industries everywhere, and the semiconductor business right along with them. And in that turbulent, dangerous moment, TSMC's board and Morris Chang himself decided the company needed its founder back at the controls. In 2009, at the age of 78, Morris Chang returned as chief executive officer of TSMC, 78 years old, and back running the company, at the front of the fight. And what a moment to come back to, because he wasn't returning to a quiet, mature business coasting along. He was returning to what may be the single most brutal technological race on Earth. The whole industry is driven by a relentless march people call Moore's Law. The number of transistors you can pack onto a chip keeps roughly doubling every couple of years. For decades, the industry has kept shrinking those transistors, cramming more and more of them into the same space, making chips ever faster and more powerful. But every step down that path gets exponentially harder and exponentially more expensive. The physics gets more punishing, the machines get more complex, and the price of a single cutting-edge fab has climbed into the many billions of dollars. Some of the most expensive factories human beings have ever built. And here is the ferocious strategic decision Morris Chang made. The decision that made TSMC not just a big foundry, but the dominant one. He chose to spend enormous sums, aggressively, to push TSMC to the absolute leading edge of manufacturing technology, rather than staying comfortably a few years behind the leaders, the way TSMC had in its early days. Chang bet the company on catching up to the frontier and then surpassing it,
on being the place that could build the most advanced chips in the world before anyone else could.
He poured billions into research and into new fabs, doubling down again and again, in a business where a single wrong bet on the next technology could cripple you.
It was an incredibly high-stakes game, and the field kept narrowing. As the cost and difficulty of staying at the cutting edge exploded, company after company simply couldn't keep up and dropped out of the leading-edge race. Making the most advanced chips became so staggeringly expensive and so technically punishing that eventually only a tiny handful of companies on the entire planet could even attempt it. And through relentless investment and manufacturing excellence, TSMC clawed its way not just into that handful, but toward the very front of it. Chang finally handed off the CEO role again in 2013. And then, in 2018, at the age of 86, he fully retired as chairman and stepped away from the company he'd founded 31 years earlier.
But the machine he'd built and pointed at the frontier kept going, and it kept winning. In the years around and after his final retirement, TSMC pulled off something almost no one would have predicted back in 1987. The small foundry that started out years behind Intel, using licensed and dated technology, caught up to Intel, and then passed it. The apprentice surpassed the master. TSMC became, by many measures, the most advanced chip manufacturer on Earth, the company others now measured themselves against, building the most sophisticated silicon that human civilization knows how to make.
And that's how you end up where this whole journey started. The chips at the heart of the artificial intelligence revolution. The processors in the most powerful phones and computers in the world. The most advanced silicon on the planet. An enormous share of it flowing out of the fabs of one company, founded by one man who came back to run it in his late 70s, and who kept it at the front of the hardest race in technology.
So, what do we make of him? What is the final measure of Morris Chang? The boy who wanted to write, the engineer who was passed over, the 56-year-old who started over? That's the question worth ending on. Lay the full measure of this one life out, and it's almost hard to believe it's a true story about a single human being. Start with the company itself. TSMC grew from that shoestring startup of 1987, the one nobody wanted to fund, built on an idea the whole industry dismissed, into one of the most valuable companies on the planet. A company that, at the leading edge, manufactures an enormous share of the world's most advanced semiconductors. When you use a smartphone, when you use a computer, when you drive a modern car, when you interact with the artificial intelligence systems reshaping our world, there is an overwhelming chance that somewhere inside is a chip that was manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan, in the company Morris Chang built. Very few individuals in history can claim to have created something that quietly touches so many billions of lives, every single day, all over the Earth. Then there's the industry he didn't just join, but fundamentally created. Before Morris Chang, the pure-play foundry did not exist as a serious business. He invented the model, and in doing so, he built the foundation on which a whole ecosystem of other great companies could stand. All those fabless design firms, some now among the most valuable enterprises in the world, exist in the space he opened. He changed the basic architecture of how humanity makes the most important product of the modern age. That is not the achievement of a good executive. That is the achievement of someone who reorganized an entire domain of human activity. And then there's the geopolitics, which may be the most astonishing part of all. Through TSMC, Morris Chang helped transform Taiwan, a small island of a few tens of millions of people living under the shadow of a giant, into an indispensable node of the global economy, a place so central to modern technology that its security became a matter of urgent concern to the most powerful governments on Earth. Whether or not you believe the Silicon Shield truly protects Taiwan, there's no denying that a company one man founded in his 50s became a genuine factor in the strategic balance between the United States and China. How many business founders end up shaping the geopolitics of superpowers? It's a vanishingly short list, and Morris Chang is on it. But the scale of it, the trillions, the geopolitics, isn't the deepest lesson of this life. The deepest lesson is more human, and it runs all the way back to the beginning. A boy born into a world on fire, who fled 3 times and lived in 6 cities and changed schools 10 times before he was 18. A boy who wanted, more than anything, to be a writer, and was told, gently and practically, to give it up. A young man who failed the exam that was supposed to define his future, twice. A man who took his career-defining job because of a $1 salary dispute and a rude phone call. A man who climbed to the very top of American industry, hit a ceiling, and was passed over. A man who, at 54, packed up his whole life and started over on a small island on the other side of the world. And a man who, at 56, founded the company that would become his masterpiece, then came back in his late 70s to keep it at the front of the hardest race in technology. Every single thing that looked like a failure, or a detour, or a closed door, turned out to be part of the path. The lost writing dream taught him to be a storyteller who happened to tell his story in Silicon. The wars taught him what really matters. The manufacturing work that others thought was unglamorous became the exact skill his whole empire was built on. Being passed over freed him to leave. Leaving America brought him to Taiwan. It's as if none of it was wasted. As if a life is only ever legible in reverse. We tell ourselves so many stories about when it's too late, about the age by which you're supposed to have done your great work, about the failures that are supposed to define you. Morris Chang's life is a quiet, thunderous rebuttal to all of it. His most important work, the work that touched the whole world, didn't begin until he was in his mid-50s, on the far side of a career that had already peaked and stalled and disappointed him. The boy who wanted to write his name into the world eventually did. Not on paper, the way he dreamed, but etched into silicon, into the hidden heart of nearly every device on Earth, and into the history of the 21st century itself. He just had to live almost an entire lifetime first to find out what story he was really here to tell.